The spark. The early morning sun broke through the city skyline, casting a faint golden glow over the streets of Westbrook, a neighborhood sandwiched between forgotten history and the quiet hopes of those who dared to dream. Tasha Owens, a single mother of a young daughter, Elisa, stood at the corner of 4th and Pine, her breath misting in the chilly morning air. She had just completed her shift at the local diner, her body drained from the long hours of back-to-back orders and clattering dishes. She had always managed to make ends meet, but lately life had been demanding more of her than she could give. As she adjusted the strap of her worn-out bag, the weight of her exhausted body was offset by the lightness in her heart. Elisa's health had been declining for the past few days, and Tasha could barely remember when she had last had a full night's sleep. Yet here she was, making her way home, determined, no matter the cost. Her feet carried her slowly, but with purpose, each step reverberating against the cracked sidewalk like a drumbeat of resilience. Tasha had learned to navigate the rough streets of Westbrook. The tension that hummed through the air was palpable. The neighborhood was no stranger to crime, yet it had an undeniable pulse, a mixture of grit and hope. It was a place that bore the marks of poverty, but also the spirit of its people who had learned not just to survive, but to fight. For Tasha, every corner of this town held a piece of her soul, but it was always a reminder of what she had to protect: her daughter, Elisa, and the dreams they shared. Her mind wandered, caught between the worry for Elisa, who had been running a high fever, and the uncertainty that haunted her daily. Would she be able to pay the rent this month? Would her daughter be okay? Would she ever catch a break? Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar sound, a distant wail of sirens. Tasha's gaze instinctively turned toward the flashing lights of a police cruiser parked at the far end of the block. Police presence wasn't uncommon in Westbrook, but today it felt different. There was an oppressive tension that hung in the air, something Tasha couldn't quite explain. She wasn't particularly afraid of the officers. After all, she had lived her whole life around them. But today, there was a sense of inevitability, as if something was about to shift in the balance of her world. She continued walking, eyes forward, pretending not to notice the way the officers were looking in her direction. It was nothing new. The looks, the whispers, the unwarranted suspicion. She had grown used to it. But as she neared the next intersection, she heard a voice that was anything but casual. "Hey, Hugh." Tasha froze, her heart skipping a beat. The voice was harsh, demanding, and too close. She turned slowly, not wanting to seem confrontational, but knowing something was off. Her body tensed as she caught sight of the officer, a tall man with a rigid posture and a face carved from stone. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes held something more dangerous than mere authority: contempt. He wasn't just doing his job, he was relishing in it. "You seem to be in a hurry," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Where do you think you're going?" Tasha's mind raced, but she kept her composure. "I'm just trying to get home," she replied, her voice steady despite the rising knot in her stomach. "Home." He stepped closer, his boots scraping against the pavement like a slow warning. "You don't look like you're just going home. Where's the rush?" Tasha's jaw tightened as she met his gaze. She could feel the judgment in his eyes, the assumptions swirling in the air between them. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered an officer like this, but something about the way he was looking at her, something colder, more hostile, made her pulse race. "I'm just trying to get to my daughter," she said, hoping her calm would be enough to diffuse the situation. "She's sick. I need to get home." The officer's lips curled into a sneer, a look that sent a ripple of unease through her. "People like you shouldn't be walking around here after dark. It's not safe for people like you," he muttered, as though Tasha's mere presence was a threat to the peace he imagined in this part of town. Tasha's breath hitched. The words stung more than they should have. She had heard them before. The subtle racism that leaked from the cracks of a system that had long considered people like her disposable. But she had learned to hold her ground. She wasn't about to let this officer reduce her to an object, something less than human. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her voice firm but calm. "I'm just trying to get home. I'm not causing any trouble." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scrutinized her, as if trying to find something to justify his actions. He was looking for an excuse, any excuse, to justify his sense of superiority. When he spoke again, it was with a level of venom that left Tasha no room for doubt. "You think I care about your daughter?" he sneered. "People like you never think about the consequences of your actions. You think the world owes you something." Tasha's heart raced, the anger rising in her chest. She had heard those words too many times in her life. The assumptions, the blame, the expectation that she would just accept it, keep quiet, and go about her day. But she was done with it. She was done being silenced. And then it happened. In one swift motion, the officer raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound of the slap echoed down the quiet street, sharp and cold. Time seemed to slow, the world around Tasha blurring as she stood there in shock. Her cheek burned, a red welt already forming where his hand had made contact. But the pain, the sting of the slap, was nothing compared to the anger that surged in her chest. Her mind cleared, and before she knew it, her body moved on its own. With the force of years of pent-up frustration, she struck back. She slapped his wrist away, twisting his arm behind his back, and with one fluid motion, she took him to the ground. For the first time in her life, Tasha stood over an officer, not as a victim, but as someone who had fought back. "Don't you ever touch me again," she said, her voice low but commanding. "I'm not your victim, and I won't be anyone's punching bag." The officer gasped, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. His partner, who had been standing off to the side, rushed forward, his face pale with shock. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. But Tasha didn't answer. She didn't have to. She took a step back, her eyes never leaving the officer on the ground. With one final glance, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. As she rounded the corner, she felt the weight of what she had just done sinking in. This moment would define her, no matter where it led. The fight had only just begun, and Tasha Owens had no idea how much her life, and the world, was about to change. The fallout. Tasha Owens walked away from the scene, her pulse racing, her mind a whirl of emotions. The slap from the officer still stung on her cheek, but it was nothing compared to the fire that had ignited inside her. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she continued down the sidewalk, her footsteps steady but heavy, each one carrying her further away from the scene and deeper into the unknown. She had acted on instinct, and now the consequences of that instinct would soon become clear. As she reached the entrance of her apartment building, the quiet of the evening wrapped around her like a shroud. The city, once bustling with noise and traffic, now seemed distant, almost foreign. The apartment complex was nothing special. 2 stories of peeling paint and cracked windows. But it was home. It was where Tasha and Elisa had built their life, even if that life was a constant struggle. She pushed open the door to the building and walked up the narrow staircase, the worn carpet beneath her feet showing the years of foot traffic, the stains, the tears. She had seen better days, but she never let the walls of this place define her. It was hers, and it was all she had. Inside, her apartment was dim, the only light coming from the flickering television where Elisa sat, her small face illuminated by the colorful images of cartoons she'd watched 1,000 times. Elisa was curled up on the couch, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her fever still a concern in the back of Tasha's mind. Tasha's heart softened as she looked at her daughter. The sight of her smile, despite her illness, was a rare light in Tasha's world. "Mommy." Elisa's voice was a soft whisper, her eyes brightening when she saw her mother. "You're home. I'm feeling better now. Look, I'm watching my favorite show." She giggled, holding up a small toy that Tasha barely recognized. Tasha smiled, a tired but genuine curve of her lips. She walked over to Elisa and knelt beside the couch, brushing the hair from her forehead. Her daughter was still warm, her skin flushed with the remains of her fever. Tasha reached for the remote control and turned off the TV, the moment of normalcy quickly slipping into something heavier, a weight she couldn't shake. "I'm glad you're feeling better, baby," Tasha said softly, her voice strained. She sat down next to her daughter and hugged her gently. "But we need to rest, okay? You've been sick all day." Elisa nodded obediently, but her eyes were filled with a curiosity far beyond her years. She looked up at her mother with concern, her little face scrunching up as she took in the bruise forming on Tasha's cheek. Tasha hadn't noticed the tenderness in her own face until she saw the way her daughter was watching her, those innocent eyes too sharp for her age. Elisa's small hand reached up and gently touched Tasha's face. "Mommy, what happened? Did that police officer hurt you?" Elisa asked, her voice quiet, almost too serious for a child of her age. Tasha's breath hitched. She had hoped to shield Elisa from the harsh realities of the world. She had never wanted her daughter to see the struggles Tasha had fought through her whole life. But today, Elisa had witnessed something that was hard to ignore. The look in her eyes, the tenderness, the worry, was enough to break Tasha's heart. How could she protect her from this? Tasha swallowed hard, trying to hold back the emotions that threatened to flood her. She gently cupped Elisa's cheek, forcing a smile, though it felt fragile. "It's nothing, baby. I'm fine. That man wasn't very nice to me, but sometimes people are like that. It's not our fault." Elisa's brow furrowed as she processed the words, her innocence mixing with the confusion that had entered her young life. "But why was he mean to you?" Elisa asked, her voice almost pleading. Tasha sighed, her fingers brushing her daughter's hair back from her face. She hadn't expected this, hadn't planned on explaining the complexities of racism, inequality, and injustice to her child. But it seemed that Elisa was already starting to understand, in her own way, that the world wasn't always fair. Sometimes people treat others unfairly because of how they look or where they come from. Tasha said, her voice soft but resolute. "That officer thought he could hurt me because he thought I was just another person to push around. But I'm not like that, Elisa. I won't let anyone hurt me, no matter who they are." Elisa's eyes searched her mother's face, trying to make sense of the words. She was just a child, but she knew that her mommy was something more than just a mother. She was a protector, a fighter. And now, in this moment, Tasha realized that Elisa was witnessing a new version of that fighter, a mother who would no longer bow to the weight of a broken system. After dinner, Tasha tucked Elisa into bed, kissing her forehead and smoothing her hair back with the gentleness of a mother who had seen too much pain but still believed in love. The soft hum of the city beyond their window was a lullaby that Tasha had grown used to. The faint sound of sirens, the occasional shout from a distant street corner, these were the rhythms of her life. But tonight, the quiet of her home felt suffocating, a reminder of the battle she had just begun and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. As she turned off the light and closed the door behind her, Tasha allowed herself a brief moment of solitude. She leaned against the wall of the hallway, her mind swirling with thoughts of the officer, the slap, and the shift in power that had begun in that moment. She had acted instinctively, but now the weight of her actions was beginning to sink in. What would happen next? What would the consequences be? She had fought back, but at what cost? The next few hours passed in a blur of restless sleep and tangled thoughts. Tasha awoke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the kitchen counter, its bright screen cutting through the darkness. She squinted, reaching for the phone and answering without looking at the caller ID. Her mind was still foggy from lack of rest, but she could already sense the storm brewing outside her apartment. "Tasha, I saw the news." Simone's voice came through the phone, frantic and urgent. "Are you okay? People are talking. It's going to get messy. Be careful." The words hit Tasha like a punch to the gut. The news. She hadn't expected it to spread so fast, but of course it had. It was a story that would ignite flames. A black woman standing up against an officer. Her actions, her defense, had caught the attention of a community that had long been marginalized, a community that had seen too many injustices go unnoticed. Simone's next words made Tasha's heart drop. "It's all over social media, Tasha. People are calling you a hero. Others are calling for your arrest. You've become a symbol." Tasha swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Simone's words like a stone in her chest. A symbol. She hadn't intended to be anyone's symbol. She had simply wanted to protect herself, to fight back against the officer's assault. But now her story had taken on a life of its own, and there was no turning back. The phone buzzed again, this time with a message from a local community activist, someone Tasha had never met personally but had heard of through the whispers of the neighborhood. The message was simple but clear. "Tasha, you're standing up for more than just yourself. This is bigger now. You need to speak out. We need to demand justice." Tasha sat there in the darkness of her kitchen, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't sought out a fight. But now she was in it. She had become part of a larger narrative, one that had been written long before she'd walked onto that street corner. As the day wore on, the pressure continued to mount. The local news stations ran coverage of the altercation, framing it as both a story of resistance and a story of conflict. They called Tasha brave, but they also questioned her actions, spinning the narrative to paint her as both the victim and the aggressor. The officer she had confronted, Officer Hart, had already filed his report, claiming that Tasha had attacked him without provocation. His partner's statement backed him up, and soon the media was fueling the fire, creating a divide in the community. Tasha didn't know which way the storm was blowing. She had fought back, yes, but now the question was, would she survive the fallout? Would anyone stand with her? And what would the price of justice be for someone like her? The turning point. Tasha Owens woke to a world that felt entirely different from the one she had left behind the night before. The sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of her bedroom was dimmer than usual, as if the day itself were muted, hesitant, unwilling to fully shine through. The usual sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the calls of street vendors, the faint echoes of children playing, were overshadowed by something new, the steady pulse of uncertainty. Her phone had buzzed all night. She hadn't checked it, but she had heard it. Each vibration, each notification, felt like another crack in the fragile veneer of normality she had been clinging to. As she sat up in bed, rubbing her tired eyes, Tasha felt a weight in her chest that was heavy and persistent. It wasn't just the fatigue, the lingering effects of the officer's slap, or the exhaustion of a long, chaotic night. It was the realization that nothing would ever be the same. She didn't even have the energy to fully process the magnitude of what had happened yet. The slap, the fight, the headlines, the people talking, whispering, judging. It felt surreal. How had her small, quiet act of self-defense, something that was supposed to be a private moment of strength, turned into something so public, so overwhelming? Tasha stood up, her body sore from the emotional and physical toll of the previous day. She walked to the kitchen, her mind already racing through the possibilities of what might happen next. The news was everywhere. From the local radio stations to the buzz on social media, Tasha had become the focal point of a larger conversation, one she hadn't signed up for. She had simply defended herself against an officer's aggression. Yet now she was thrust into a position she had never asked for, a place where every word, every action would be scrutinized. As she opened the refrigerator, the cool air inside did nothing to calm the heat rising in her chest. She had just grabbed a carton of milk when her phone buzzed again. This time, she couldn't ignore it. With a sigh, she glanced at the screen, her heart sinking as she read the message from Simone. "Tasha, you're going to need to speak out. There's a protest at the police station today. People want answers. This isn't just about you anymore. You're becoming the face of something bigger." Simone's words were clear, but the weight behind them was suffocating. Tasha closed her eyes, swallowing hard. She had already taken a stand by fighting back, by refusing to let an officer push her around. But she hadn't thought of the consequences, She hadn't expected her act of defiance to become a call to arms for an entire community, and now she wasn't sure what she was supposed to do next. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She wasn't just a woman trying to survive in a system that had never shown her compassion. She was a symbol, a rallying cry for those who had been silenced, for those who had been overlooked, for those who had spent their lives being told that their pain didn't matter. Tasha was no longer just Tasha Owens. She was a beacon, a bright, burning light that shone in the darkness. And with that light came the shadows. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a constant reminder of the time slipping away. She didn't have much choice. If she didn't speak out, the narrative would be written for her. Her silence would be just as loud as her voice, and that terrified her more than anything. She had already been accused, painted as both the victim and the villain in the media. If she didn't take control of her story, it would slip beyond her grasp. Tasha glanced over at Elisa's room, the soft sound of the television echoing through the thin walls. Her daughter had no idea what was happening, no understanding of how this day would shape their lives. Elisa was safe in her innocence for now, but how long could Tasha protect her from the storm that was coming? Taking a deep breath, Tasha wiped her hands on her jeans and grabbed her jacket from the back of the chair. She couldn't do this alone. She needed to find someone who understood the fight that was unfolding around her. She needed to talk to someone who knew what it was like to stand up against a broken system and demand change. Simone had been her best friend since high school, a fierce and unwavering ally in every sense of the word. She had always been the first to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. But even Simone couldn't fully understand what Tasha was going through. No one could. When Tasha arrived at the local coffee shop where Simone worked, she found her friend standing behind the counter, her brow furrowed with worry as she wiped down the surface. As soon as Tasha stepped inside, Simone's eyes locked onto her, and without a word, she came around to the front, pulling Tasha into a tight embrace. "I can't believe this is happening," Simone whispered, her voice heavy with concern. "I've seen the news. They're painting you as a hero, but they're also calling for your arrest. You need to be careful. This is getting bigger than either of us expected." Tasha pulled away slightly, her eyes meeting Simone's with a mix of exhaustion and determination. "I didn't want this. I didn't ask for any of this," Tasha said, her voice shaking. "I just wanted to get home. I wanted to protect my daughter. And now?" Simone nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know, but it's bigger than you now. You're a symbol, Tasha. People are looking to you to fight for them. You've become a voice for everyone who's been treated unfairly, for everyone who's been silenced." Tasha swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to overwhelm her. "But I didn't ask to be anyone's symbol. I just wanted to survive." Simone placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing it gently. "I know, but sometimes survival is a revolution in itself. You fought back when no one else would. That's not nothing. And now you have a choice, whether to shrink away or to stand up and lead." Tasha felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Simone was right. She could turn away, hide from the storm that was coming, but that would mean letting the injustice continue, letting the system keep crushing those who couldn't fight back. She could become invisible again, or she could rise above it. The decision was hers, and it was time to make it. She took a deep breath, her chest tight with the enormity of it all. "What do I do now?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. Simone smiled, a small but encouraging gesture. "You speak out. You tell your story. You remind people that this is about more than just you. It's about all of us. You make sure they know you're not just a victim. You're a survivor, and that's something worth fighting for." Tasha nodded, the weight in her chest beginning to shift. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be comfortable. But this was the moment where she stopped being silent. This was where the fight began for real. As she turned to leave the coffee shop, Simone called out to her, "Tasha, whatever happens, remember you're not alone in this. We've got you." With those words, Tasha felt a flicker of hope, a spark in the darkness. The road ahead was uncertain, and the storm was far from over. But in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. She wasn't going to run from her fight. Not now. Not ever. And with that, Tasha Owens walked out into the world that was waiting for her, ready to face whatever came next. The battle for truth. The days following the confrontation with Officer Hart were a blur of interviews, phone calls, protests, and constant media attention. Tasha had become the focal point of a firestorm, and whether she liked it or not, her life had been turned into something larger, something that no longer belonged just to her. The community, both local and national, had taken notice, and now she was not just a mother trying to make it through the day, but a symbol of resistance, of defiance, of the struggle for justice. The streets of Westbrook, once familiar to her, now seemed alien, teeming with reporters, activists, and protesters who were marching for change. Signs that read "Justice for Tasha" and "End Police Brutality" appeared on every corner, in every shop window. At first, it had all felt surreal, like a fever dream she couldn't shake. But now, as the days wore on, it began to settle into a reality that she couldn't ignore. Everywhere she went, the whispers followed. People on the street, in the grocery store, in her neighborhood. They all knew her face. They knew her story. Some people called her a hero, others a troublemaker. But they all knew her name, and with that recognition came a level of scrutiny Tasha wasn't prepared for. She had never wanted to be anyone's hero. She had simply acted to protect herself. She hadn't asked for any of this, but now that it was happening, she had to live with the consequences. On the morning of the protest at the police station, Tasha stood in front of her apartment mirror, the reflection staring back at her with eyes that were tired beyond her years. The bruise from the slap had faded slightly, but it still lingered, a reminder of everything that had transpired. She had a bruise on her face, yes, but the emotional scars ran much deeper. It wasn't just about one officer's assault. It was about everything that led up to it. The years of being silenced, of being treated as less than, of watching her people suffer under the weight of systemic oppression. The slap was just the breaking point, the wake-up call. She ran a hand over her face and sighed. Today wasn't just about standing up for herself anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, everyone who had ever been pushed down by the system. It was about demanding justice in a world that often forgot to deliver it. Tasha grabbed her coat, pulling it tightly around her shoulders. The air outside was cold, the kind of cold that cut straight through to the bone. It was the kind of day that felt like a warning, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. And today, Tasha was going to make sure it did. When she arrived at the police station, the scene was unlike anything she had ever seen. Hundreds of people had gathered, their voices rising in unison, calling for justice. It wasn't just Westbrook anymore. This protest had become part of a larger movement, a movement that was sweeping across the country, demanding an end to police brutality, to the systemic racism that plagued their communities. Tasha stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart beating faster than it ever had before. The energy was electric, but it was also terrifying. She had never been one for large crowds, never been one to seek attention. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just an observer. She was part of this. She was a catalyst for change, whether she liked it or not. Simone found her within minutes, her presence a comforting anchor amidst the chaos. "You ready?" Simone asked, her voice steady, but tinged with an urgency that matched the mood of the crowd. Tasha nodded, though the knot in her stomach tightened. "As ready as I'll ever be." Together, they walked toward the front of the crowd where a group of local leaders and activists had gathered. Among them was Malik, a well-known community organizer who had been at the forefront of protests in the city for years. He was the one who had encouraged Tasha to speak out, to stand in front of the crowd and tell her story. And now, it was time to do just that. As the microphone was handed to Tasha, she hesitated for a moment, her fingers trembling slightly. The crowd was watching her, waiting for her to speak, to tell them what had happened. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her like a physical force. She didn't want to disappoint them. She didn't want to be the person who failed them. But as she took the microphone in her hand, something inside her clicked into place. She wasn't just standing there for herself anymore. She was standing there for all of them. For every mother who had to worry about her child's safety in a world that seemed designed to break them. For every man who had been wronged. For every person of color who had faced the cruel sting of racism. For every voice that had been silenced for too long. "Thank you," Tasha began, her voice steady, though it wavered with the weight of everything she felt. "Thank you for being here, for showing up, for standing with me, with us, in this fight for justice." She paused, glancing out over the sea of faces in the crowd. They were all different, young and old, black and white, men and women. But they were united by one thing, the desire for change. And in that moment, Tasha knew that they had the power to make it happen. "I never wanted this. I didn't ask for any of this," Tasha continued, her voice rising with emotion. "But when that officer slapped me, when he thought he could treat me like I was less than human, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let him do it. I wasn't going to let him walk all over me, not anymore. But it wasn't just about me. It's about all of us." The crowd was silent now, listening intently. Tasha's words were cutting through the noise, hitting something deep inside them. She could feel their attention, their energy, all focused on her. "We're all fighting the same fight," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We're all fighting against a system that tells us we don't matter. But we do. We matter. And we're not going to stop fighting until that truth is undeniable." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers and chants filling the air. It wasn't just for Tasha anymore. It was for all of them. And as she stood there, in the center of it all, she felt something shift inside her. The fear that had gripped her for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a powerful sense of purpose. She was no longer just Tasha Owens, a single mother trying to survive. She was Tasha Owens, a woman standing at the forefront of a movement that demanded change. As the protest raged on, Tasha found herself speaking again and again, her words not just reaching the crowd but igniting something in them. Her story, once just a personal struggle, had become a battle cry for something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. The media, which had once sensationalized the confrontation between Tasha and Officer Hart, now followed her every move, capturing her speeches, her messages of hope, her call for justice. But with the attention came the backlash. People who had once seen Tasha as a simple woman, just trying to make it through the day, now saw her as a threat. The police department was scrambling to control the narrative, spinning their own version of events, trying to paint Tasha as the aggressor. The local news ran interviews with Officer Hart, who claimed that Tasha had assaulted him without provocation, that she had been the one to escalate the situation. But Tasha wasn't backing down. She couldn't. The battle was far from over. It was only just beginning. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows over the protesters still standing in the streets, Tasha stood tall, her gaze unwavering. The fight for justice was far from easy, but it was hers now. And she would fight with everything she had, for herself, for her daughter, and for every person who had ever been told they didn't matter. The reckoning. The night following the protest was an uneasy one. Tasha could feel the tension in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst, and she wasn't sure whether it was the weight of everything that had happened or the sense of purpose that was now driving her. Her body was exhausted, her mind spinning with everything that had transpired. Yet she couldn't escape the feeling that the real battle had only just begun. The small apartment was quieter now, Elisa already fast asleep in her room, tucked under her favorite blanket. Tasha stood in the living room, staring out the window, watching the city that had been her home for so long. It felt distant now, the streets she had walked every day suddenly unfamiliar. The lights of Westbrook flickered in the distance, but there was no comfort in their glow anymore. What had once been the backdrop to her struggles, to her small victories, now felt like a stage set for something much bigger, something she didn't fully understand. Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her back to the present. She picked it up, her fingers brushing the screen, only to see the notification from Simone. Tasha, the media's spinning this all in different directions. They're calling you a hero in some places, but in others, they're calling for your arrest. We need to be prepared. Are you okay? Tasha sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of Simone's words. The storm was growing, and no matter how hard she tried, there was no escaping it. She couldn't just fight for herself anymore. She was fighting for her community, for her daughter, and for everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't belong. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The local news continued to cover the story, but each report seemed to paint her in a different light. Some outlets lauded her as a hero, someone who had stood up against a corrupt system. Others, including some prominent figures within the police department, vilified her as an instigator, an aggressor who had brought violence to a peaceful neighborhood. It was the same story, but it felt like the narrative was slipping out of her control. Tasha had become the focal point of a much larger conversation, one that stretched far beyond her own life. The protesters were still gathering, their chants for justice ringing through the streets of Westbrook. The anger was palpable. The fight was no longer just about her. It was about something deeper. It was about accountability, about making sure that those who held power would answer for their actions. It was about ensuring that the system, which had long been stacked against people like her, was held responsible. But the pressure was building. Tasha couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers had turned into demands. There were calls from both the community and the media for her to speak at rallies, to appear on talk shows, to become the public face of the movement she hadn't asked to be part of. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't do this alone. Simone had been her anchor, the one person who had always stood beside her. She had known Simone since high school, and over the years, Simone had become more than just a friend. She was her confidant, her strength when Tasha was at her lowest. But even Simone couldn't fully understand what Tasha was going through. No one could. One afternoon, as Tasha sat in the small cafe that had become her temporary refuge, she watched as the world outside seemed to spin on without her. The protesters, the news crews, the endless flow of people in and out. It was like she was trapped in the eye of a hurricane. Everything around her was in chaos, but she felt a strange stillness, as if the storm had yet to fully hit. Simone slid into the seat across from her, her face drawn with concern, but also a quiet determination. "You're holding up better than I expected," she said, her eyes scanning Tasha's face. "I thought you'd be crumbling by now, with all the pressure." Tasha chuckled darkly, though the sound lacked any true humor. "I've been through worse," she said, her voice low. "I've had to fight for everything in my life. This is just one more thing." Simone's gaze softened, and she leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Tasha, you're more than just one more person. You're not just fighting for you anymore. You've become the face of this fight. And that's why you have to be careful. The system is coming for you." Tasha's stomach twisted at her friend's words. She had suspected it, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Simone reached for her hand, her grip firm. "The backlash is coming. You know they're not going to just let this go. They'll try to discredit you, tear you down. The officer you confronted, his people are already fighting to protect him. They're going to make you the villain, no matter how much truth you speak." Tasha's eyes widened. She had known, deep down, that this was bigger than just her. But the reality of it, the cold, harsh truth of what Simone was saying, made her stomach churn. "I don't know if I can handle this," Tasha admitted, her voice barely audible. "I'm not prepared for this kind of fight. I just wanted to get home to my daughter. I just wanted to protect her." Simone squeezed her hand tighter. "I know. But you've already started this. You're not going back now. You've become a symbol, Tasha. And whether you're ready or not, you're going to have to stand up and keep fighting." The weight of Simone's words hit Tasha like a ton of bricks. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted to be anyone's symbol. But now, her actions were being painted as something far bigger than herself. She was no longer just a woman defending her right to walk home. She was the face of a revolution, a person who had become the focus of the fight for justice in Westbrook, and perhaps even beyond. That night, as Tasha returned home, the walls of her apartment felt like they were closing in. The noise of the outside world, the protests, the news coverage, the constant messages filtered through the thin walls. But it was the silence in her apartment that felt the loudest. Elisa was asleep, her small body curled up in her bed. Tasha stood in the doorway of her daughter's room, watching her sleep, her heart breaking at the thought of the world she was raising her in. Elisa had already witnessed something no child should have to, her mother being slapped by a police officer. And now, Tasha realized that she couldn't protect her from what was coming. The storm was here, and it would touch every part of their lives. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Tasha froze for a moment, uncertain of who it could be at this hour. She had learned to be cautious, to keep her guard up. She wasn't sure if it was the police, reporters, or someone else with an agenda. When she opened the door, her heart skipped a beat. It was Malik, the community organizer who had been instrumental in rallying the protests. His presence here, unannounced, sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't just anyone. He was someone who knew how to navigate the dangerous waters of activism, someone who could help her keep her head above water. "Tasha." Malik greeted her with a nod, his voice low. "I know things are getting difficult, but we need to talk. There's a way forward. We can't let them destroy what you've started." Tasha stepped aside to let him in, her mind racing. She had heard of Malik's work before, his efforts to organize and bring attention to the issues plaguing their community. But this was different. She wasn't sure she was ready for the path he was offering her. As they sat down, Malik leaned in, his eyes sharp with focus. "We need to move fast," he said. "The media's already shifting the story. They're painting you as either a hero or a criminal, but we can't let them decide what happens next. We need to get ahead of this, control the narrative." Tasha's throat tightened as she listened to him. She hadn't known how to move forward, how to navigate this chaos. But Malik was offering her a lifeline, a way to stand firm against the mounting pressure. "You don't have to do this alone, Tasha," Malik continued. "But you need to be strategic. If you stand firm, speak out, and keep pushing for the changes you want, we can shift the tide. This is more than just your fight. It's about making sure no one has to go through what you went through." Tasha stared at him, the reality of what was being asked of her sinking in. This wasn't just a moment of defiance. It was a movement. It was a battle that would define not only her future but the future of her community. She stood up slowly, her mind made up. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "Let's do this." In that moment, Tasha Owens understood the magnitude of the fight before her. It wasn't just about speaking out. It was about changing a system that had broken too many people for too long. And she would be the one to take that first step. The reckoning had begun, and Tasha was no longer afraid. The rise. The days that followed the conversation with Malik were filled with a sense of purpose that Tasha had never known. She had always fought to survive, to protect her daughter, to navigate a world that was stacked against her. But now, she was fighting for something bigger, a cause that reached beyond her own struggles and resonated with the lives of so many others. The storm was no longer just a distant threat. It had already made landfall, and Tasha was at the center of it. The first step was to take control of the narrative. Tasha knew she couldn't afford to let the media, the police, or anyone else define her. If she wanted her voice to be heard, if she wanted the world to understand her story, she had to speak on her own terms. She had to be the one to set the stage for what was to come. With Malik's help, She arranged a press conference, something that felt both empowering and terrifying at the same time. The weight of the decision hung heavily on her shoulders. Standing in front of a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing in every direction, was a daunting prospect. But there was no turning back. She was no longer just a woman trying to survive. She was a leader now, whether she had asked for that role or not. The day of the press conference arrived, and Tasha stood in front of the microphone, her heart beating rapidly in her chest. The room was packed with reporters, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment, some ready to pounce on her words, others eager to find fault. Tasha took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't just about explaining her actions. It was about changing the conversation. It was about demanding justice not just for herself, but for everyone who had been hurt by a broken system. As she spoke, her voice was steady, her words deliberate. "I'm not here because I wanted attention," she began, looking out over the sea of journalists. "I'm here because I was wronged. I'm here because the system that is supposed to protect us has, for too long, been used to oppress and silence people like me. People like my daughter." She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. The room was silent now, every eye trained on her. Tasha felt the weight of their stares, but she refused to let it intimidate her. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, who had been told that their lives didn't matter. "I didn't ask to be a symbol," she continued, her voice rising. "I didn't ask for anyone to look at me and say, 'You're a hero.' I'm not a hero. I'm just a mother who defended herself when she was attacked, and I refuse to let anyone, no officer, no system, define me or my worth." The reporters exchanged looks, some of them scribbling notes, others adjusting their cameras. Tasha's words were having an impact. They were the truth, raw and unfiltered. She was tired of the narratives that had been imposed on people like her, people who had been told their entire lives that they were less than, that their pain didn't matter. "But this fight is about more than just one woman," she added, her gaze sweeping across the room. "This fight is about every person who has ever been treated like they don't belong. This fight is about justice, accountability, and a world where people are no longer afraid to speak the truth. We cannot allow this system to keep breaking us. We will rise." The room erupted into a mixture of applause and shouts. Some people were cheering. Others were murmuring in disbelief. The reporters had come in with preconceived notions about what they would hear, but Tasha had just turned everything on its head. She wasn't the victim they had imagined. She wasn't the villain they had tried to paint her as. She was something far more dangerous. She was a force of change. The press conference was just the beginning. From there, Tasha's story spread across the nation. Her words resonated with people who had long been ignored, marginalized, and oppressed. Her refusal to back down in the face of adversity sparked something in others, a quiet, simmering rage that had been waiting for an outlet. And now, they had one. Tasha's actions had sparked a movement, one that was growing stronger with every passing day. The protests in Westbrook continued to swell, but now they were joined by people from all over the city, and even from other towns and states. People who had never met Tasha, who didn't know her personally, were rallying behind her cause. They were demanding accountability. They were demanding that the system be held accountable, and Tasha was right there with them, standing in the front lines, speaking out at every opportunity, giving interviews, attending meetings with activists and local leaders, doing whatever she could to make sure the momentum didn't die. But as the movement gained traction, so did the opposition. The police department, the media, and the powerful figures who had a stake in maintaining the status quo were quick to push back. Officer Hart, the officer who had slapped Tasha, became a martyr for some, a symbol of a law enforcement system that was desperate to maintain control. His supporters began to flood the media with stories, casting doubt on Tasha's account of the events. They painted her as an agitator, as someone who had provoked the situation, someone who had escalated things unnecessarily. The smear campaign against her was relentless. Tasha's phone never stopped ringing. Messages poured in from every direction. Activists wanting her to speak at rallies, reporters asking for exclusive interviews, police unions trying to discredit her. It was overwhelming. The pressure to keep pushing forward, to remain the face of this movement, weighed on her. There were moments when she wanted to give up, when the exhaustion threatened to consume her. But then she would think of Elisa, lying in bed at night, unaware of the world her mother was fighting to change. Elisa was her motivation. She had to keep fighting for her future. Tasha had long ago realized that she couldn't win this fight alone. She couldn't change the world by herself, but she didn't have to. She had a whole community behind her, people who had walked the same path, faced the same struggles, and who were now standing with her in this fight. And together, they were stronger than any one person could be. One evening, as Tasha sat in her apartment, looking out the window at the protesters gathered outside the police station, she felt a sense of clarity. The fight had become about more than just justice for herself. It had become about justice for everyone who had been wronged, for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had ever been treated as less than human. It was a fight that was bigger than her. It was a fight that had to be won. She stood up, her gaze steady, her heart resolute. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, Tasha felt a sense of power. She knew that no matter how much they tried to tear her down, no matter how many lies they told, she would rise above it. She had already survived so much, and she wasn't going to stop now. The world was changing, and Tasha Owens was at the forefront of that change. She would fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, for everyone who had ever been silenced. She would fight until the system was forced to hear them, until they had no choice but to listen. She would rise.